Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. St. Louis, of course, is a city largely built on immigrants, Germans, Italians, Irish, Bosnian. Among most major cities, though, St. Louis had a small Hispanic population until recently. Now, that's largely because during the Great Depression, Hispanics were driven out of the city as a threat to the jobs of native-born Americans. St. Louis lost around half of its Mexican population between 1929 and 1935 due to threats and intimidation. 90 years later, threats and intimidation against immigrants are on the rise nationally, led by the President of the United States. The so-called Muslim bans, children separated from their parents and kept in cages on the Mexican border, racist tweets aimed at congresswomen, chants at a rally of "Send her back." Donald Trump's immigration policies seemed clearly to be based in racism and bigotry aimed at non-white immigrants. But at the same time, the Federal Bureau of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has been given expanded enforcement powers this week to question anyone, anywhere in the United States and ask for proof of citizenship. On July 22nd, ICE agents in Kansas City boxed in the car driven by undocumented immigrant Florencio Milan and his partner Cheyenne Holt. They were taking their 11-year-old son to the doctor. Their infant was also in the car. Holt and the two children are American citizens. Milan asked the agents to see their warrant. They claimed they had a, quote, paperless warrant. Hoyt shot the scene and streamed it on Facebook.
You know you're not. Yes, we are. You know you're not able to do that. Like I understand what you're trying to do.
You get it the hard way or the easy way. It's up to you.
But you know you're.
Are you gonna get out or not?
You're not able to do that.
Floor don't. Floor don't.
Come on, buddy.
Hold on.
You're not making
They got him on the ground.
On that same day, ICE agents attempted to arrest a man and his 12-year-old son near Nashville. It didn't go so well. Friends and neighbors formed a human chain around the man's vehicle. After a standoff in which the neighbors, all U.S. citizens, refused to move, the federal agents gave up and drove away without making an arrest. Amid all of this, our guest today continues her work. Anna Crosslin has headed the St. Louis's International Institute since 1978. Every year, the Institute helps roughly 8,000 immigrants and refugees in the St. Louis area. She was recognized by the White House for her work in 2015. So no, not the Trump White House. Anna Crosslin, welcome to the program. Thank you very much for being with us. Now, you had said before the program started that most of the work the International Institute does is with refugees. Tell me what's happened to the refugee population in St. Louis in the last 3 years during the Trump administration.
Yeah. Well, I think people don't understand, really, let me backtrack just a moment and say people don't necessarily understand that all foreign-born individuals who arrive in the United States come through three paths. One is the immigrant path with a capital I, and those people include family reunification and people who are coming over here with H-1Bs, for instance.
H-1B visas,
right,
the high-skilled
visas. High-skilled visas, and refugees. And so that's one category. Then there's a temporary visa category that covers foreign students and visitors and people like that. And then there's a third category that covers the individuals that we refer to as the undocumented. And those are people either whose papers have expired or who simply never had papers. Here in St. Louis, we segment how we largely assist the populations to be able to maximize our efforts. And so St. Francis Community Center, which is part of the Catholic Charities Network, is primarily charged with being able to assist the undocumented, who include the unaccompanied minors, Central Americans, et cetera, who are now caught at the southern border. And so we are supportive of those services. Some of our services probably include some people who are undocumented. But our primary purpose is to work with the people who are in the first category, which are the refugees, the H-1B visa holders, and the family reunification candidates. Now, with regard to the refugee program itself, that's another battle area right now that people aren't hearing much about because there is so much focus, and rightly so, on what's happening at the southern border. But in the midst of all of this, then, refugee resettlement, since the advent of the Trump White House, has been cut severely in terms of admissions to the United States. In the last year of the Obama administration, there were admitted 85,000 refugees from around the world. The first year after Trump moved into the White House, the number was cut then to 45,000, then to 30,000, and the rumors now are, because they're in negotiation for the coming year, that the White House intends to propose zero admissions for next year.
How many of those refugees, well, first off, let me back up before I get to the situation in St. Louis. To be a refugee, what sort of criteria do you have to meet? Do you have to come from some war zone where your entire family's life is in immediate danger from indiscriminate bombing, someplace like Syria or Iraq, or are there other categories?
Refugee is a category that is designated for people who have a well-founded fear of persecution. And so should they return to their home country, they are in jeopardy at that point of losing their lives. So yes, it is indeed about war-torn countries around the world. While there are a considerable number of individuals we've heard about over the years, for instance, and in fact accusations that there are economic refugees that are trying to come in from Mexico and Central America. The reality is that refugees itself as a term is a political term, and it depends on classification of individuals from around the world by the United Nations, giving them refugee status, and then the U.S. approving a certain number of those individuals from countries that they pre-approve in advance for admissions to the United States.
So the
long-time vetting process.
So the refugees would have to be certified by the United Nations first, and then the U.S. would essentially cherry pick among them and say, we'll take these guys.
This year we'll settle people from these 7 countries or something like this. This is what happened in the first year then of the Trump administration with the travel ban, was that they had 9 countries that they said, oh, we won't resettle individuals from those because we have decided that those individuals as a group are unsafe to resettle in the United States.
Including civilians from Syria, which had been gutted by war for the longest time, and who were a fair number of the refugees who ended up settling in St. Louis. In St. Louis, how many refugees before the policy kicked in, where were they mostly from?
Well, in fiscal year 2016, which was the last year of the Obama administration, we actually sponsored 1,158 refugees into St. Louis. This past year, in the second year of the Trump administration, we welcomed 177 people.
A tenth as many.
Yeah, just a pittance, even though the refugee program worldwide now is the largest it's been since World War II, that there are that many people in need. But we simply have stopped resettling, and we were prior by the end of the Obama administration, we were the largest resettler of refugees in the world at 85,000. So those numbers were really important to the refugee program.
Now here in St. Louis, it's dropped off from better than 1,000 to fewer than 200. Where are those people from? Where are they from mostly?
Well, and that's the big change too. If you look at those 1,100, they included a significant number of individuals who came from the Middle East. We had 300 Syrians, for instance, that we were sponsoring during that period. We also had Iraqis, a large number of Iraqis who were arriving here, and so and Somalis also. But both Somalia and Syria now are on the banned list of arrivals to the United States.
So that number's now zero.
Yeah, and so it's zero. And so these were the totally sad part of this was that these were family members that people here in St. Louis, refugees that had already arrived here, were waiting for family members to join them. These individuals had already been through the 13 vetting steps. They were basically waiting for their planes in a lot of cases, and then whammy, it was all over because we simply excluded them.
Now there are 2 levels to this. There's the human story and the economic impact on a place
Right.
like St. Louis. Let's go with the human story first. I can only imagine that the refusal of the United States to resettle refugees in St. Louis and other places has led to a lot of people getting killed.
Well, if you think about it, every year that the refugee program has been cut, it's a significant thousands and thousands of people. While they may not have been killed, they certainly have remained in destitute situations, sometimes in countries where bombs are still falling, sometimes in refugee camps where there simply isn't enough money or shelter for them. And so it is a drastic situation in many of these countries. These are individuals that, in fact, we'd already said we would resettle and were in the pipeline at the time that the rules got changed.
Let's talk about the economic impact. St. Louis has been economically stagnant for decades. One of the problems has been that that St. Louis does not have a very large population of foreign-born citizens, historically, at least not since the 19th century. Because of that, what is the impact of these freezes been on the economy of St. Louis? You'd mentioned a figure earlier before we went on the air that there were a lot of job shortages around here and that these immigrants and refugees could have helped fill them, and now they can't. Explain the overall, the macroeconomic impact of all this.
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that so many people, because they only have a certain part of the knowledge base, don't understand that refugees and immigrants actually help build economy. They don't take away from economy. The challenges that cities like St. Louis have are that we have a limited pie, and what we keep trying to do is divide that pie smaller and smaller and smaller instead of trying to grow or make a larger pie. The way that you make a larger pie is with growth in your economy, which has to do with entrepreneurship, small business development. It has to do with being able to find additional workers, particularly for certain kinds of specialty work at that point that you might not be able to fill otherwise in the community. People don't realize, but if you think about it, when the bomb falls on the village overseas, it's not just pre-literate farmers who at that point have to flee. It's everybody from the college faculty member to the business person to the farmer, etc. So refugees are really a very varied population. They bring a lot of skills and assets with them. And so these individuals become entrepreneurs in the community. They help, in fact, they were part of the catalyst to building South Grand, the international district on South Grand right now because of their strong entrepreneurship. But they also have started other kinds of businesses as well. And so they've created jobs not just for their families, but also for the community. Same thing with employment. These people fill jobs, particularly in STEM areas. People don't realize that about 20% of the refugees, in fact, who arrive here on an annual basis, actually have some or college degrees at that point from overseas. So they bring skills with them that they can use to fill parts of our market right now that because the economy is improving and we're reaching what at least we're told is a full employment that we don't have enough people to be able to interview for and fill some of these jobs. So these people help to supplement the economy. Some of the numbers I think are so interesting. As you said, we have since 1999 helped about 500 refugee and immigrant-owned businesses get a start in the community, and the St. Louis Regional Chamber then has estimated that value using their data crunching information at about $180 million of positive economic impact in the community, just from the immigrants and refugees with whom we work. Imagine when you think about 130,000 immigrants in St. Louis, what the economic impact of that is. Same kinds of numbers when you look at employment, in fact.
Well, we've all seen that since the Srebrenica massacre 25 years ago, that the Bosnian refugees in St. Louis, not to put too fine a point on it, literally saved big parts of the city, initiated growth, started new businesses, revitalized it. You have equal bloodshed going on in many parts of the country now, and yet this administration refuses to let people in. I would imagine, it's hard to say what your economic loss is from something you've never seen.
Right.
But it would seem to me, just based on the Bosnian experience, that the potential economic loss to the city of St. Louis is absolutely mammoth
It
from
is.
not letting these refugees
And
in.
it's not just from refugees, but let's take another group right now that's having difficulty getting into the United States and how that's impacting St. Louis, and that's foreign students. If you think about it, we have more than 20 universities in the St. Louis area right now. I think something like 9,000 foreign students or something at the universities. Well, we have issues because it's becoming so difficult to get a visa, particularly if you come from those banned countries that we talked about before. But also what's happening is that the trade wars right now are having impact on whether students from China, for instance, study in the United States or not. These are individuals who are, number one, full pay students at these universities at the foreign student rate, which is the highest rate that's there. So they are, in fact, supplementing the budget at that point for American-born students who are looking for scholarships. But on top of that, then, these individuals, once they get over here, become prime targets once they've graduated, especially from STEM work, for local corporations, for instance, to fill those STEM jobs that are going wanting right now. So the negative economic impact isn't just about refugees. It isn't just about its H-1Bs being cut. It isn't just about the new EB-5 program, in fact, having new caps now so that foreign investors who want to start businesses in the United States are now going to have more money to be able to do it. It's about foreign students. It's about every single one of these categories is being twiddled with or fooled with in the middle of all this, and to what avail?
Well, this new explosion of nationalism, white nationalism and nativism, harkens back to the 1840s when the Germans and the Irish were vilified, on through when Asians were not allowed to settle in the United States. I mean, this country has a really rich racist history of trying to keep people out. But as someone who spent a career doing this, since 1978, how disappointing is it to you that these waves of xenophobia and nationalism and nativism are putting up barriers all around the country and keeping out potentially very, very productive people from having any part in America and Americans benefiting from that? I mean, did you shake your head and wonder, I didn't think we'd go back here again?
I did, but I'm reminded sometimes about that adage about those who don't understand their history are bound to repeat it. And I think that's part of what's going on right now, is that many people really only know certain segments, particularly of their own history, or they only know certain things about people, and they happen to be people they already know. One of the challenges that we have in places like St. Louis and so much of America is that we don't, in fact, live around the rich diversity that one has on the two coasts. Instead, you know, we kind of grow up and live around our neighbor. We meet our friends in kindergarten. We have our families here, and our world is very limited in some ways. One of the interesting statistics, I think, is that Missouri is in the bottom 1/3 of the states in terms of passport issuance. Now, what does that say? If you don't have a passport, you probably aren't traveling, at least outside the United States. Well, if you're not traveling outside the United States, and the percentage of immigrants here in St. Louis is lower than it might be on the coast, how are you really having those experiences that help you to understand the advantages of living in a multicultural environment? Instead, you're fearful of it. So there are reasons why all of this happened. I understand the reasons, but I thought we'd gotten a little bit, incrementally, I thought we had gotten a little bit further forward than it now appears we have.
Final question for you. You had said one of the more disturbing things to you was the effect this has had on kids, because since this ramping up of anti-immigrant rhetoric and xenophobia and the go back to where you came from nonsense rearing its ugly head again, that a lot of kids have been, of refugees and immigrants, you guys hear stories of, are being harassed in school by other students.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that it's always been a circumstance where bullying and othering the foreign-born individual has been prominent. Kids say bad things, but now what's happening is that kids, like adults, are feeling like they have permission to be able to say things that they wouldn't have before because they hear it all the time at home. They hear it on TV. They're inundated with all of this debating that we do very loudly as adults to each other. And they think, oh, okay, I can duplicate that myself, and it's okay. It's that it's okay that's the problem right now. It used to be you had some of this, but it was in spite of the fact that everybody was trying to help them understand that you really needed to be kind and approachable and welcoming to people who are not like them. Now, that's not the message anymore, and the kids are really suffering for it.
What happens if this is not a temporary phenomenon? If this isn't just a short-term thing, if there is serious xenophobia, racism, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiment that carries on for the next years into the future, what do you think that's going to do?
It could eventually bubble up. You talked about the late 1800s, and that was the whole nativist period. The Know Nothing Party was, came into being. There was a lot of xenophobia in this country. Oh my God, the Yellow Peril and all kinds of different comics that were in the paper, yellow journalism, etc. It all culminated in 1924 then with the Immigration Act of 1924, which was till then the most restrictive immigration laws that came onto the books. We didn't have passports. We weren't. We didn't have U.S. citizenship. That wasn't historically something that was in America. People will say to me, oh, gee, my parents did it the right way. They came over here legally. If they arrived before 1924, there was no such thing. But in 1924, then, it changed, and the world became much narrower, including, for instance, they set quotas for the first time for countries. And the quotas were based on admissions in 1890. And so the Jews, for instance, because they weren't arriving here in 1890, 25 years later, they weren't admissible. So it was a way for them to and then we had 40 years until 1965 when LBJ passed the Immigration Act of 65, where basically we had nobody except for a few Northern European immigrants who arrived in the United States. And if, quite frankly, it hadn't been for the economic growth that occurred because of World War II and the manufacturing, we might have seen a different kind of a cycle in terms of where we ended up being by 1960 economically.
Anna Crosslin. Anna, a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming in.
Happy to do it.
Our thanks to Anna Crosslin from the International Institute, and for you for being with us. We hope to see you right back here next week for another edition of the Jaco Report. Thanks for being with us.